3. Dynamic relationship between leadership and culture. Diagnosing cultural relationships, a key to effective leadership. Edgar Schein's framework for understanding organizational culture emphasizes the crucial role of cultural diagnosis in effective leadership. Diagnosing an organization's culture is essential for leaders who aim to understand and influence the complex dynamics within their organizations, navigate decision-making processes, and enhance the overall capacity for change. This diagnostic process involves a comprehensive evaluation of several interrelated components of culture, as outlined by Schein. Understanding the group's history. Foundational history. The historical context of an organization can provide invaluable insights into its current cultural state. Leaders need to explore the origins of the organization, why it was created, the vision of its founders, and the initial challenges it faced. This history often shapes the core values and norms that persist over time. Evolution. Over time, understanding how the organization has evolved in response to internal and external pressure such as changes in leadership, market dynamics, or global events helps leaders grasp why certain practices or attitudes are deeply embedded. This evolution can reveal shifts in culture that are pivotal in defining the organization's present character. Identifying current visible artifacts. Physical and social artifacts. Visible artifacts include the physical layout of workspaces, dress codes, and also social artifacts like language, rituals, and ceremonies. For example, open-plan offices might suggest a culture of openness and collaboration, while formal titles and reserved parking spots could indicate a hierarchical culture. Technology and tools. The technology and tools an organization uses can also be telling. For instance, the adoption of cutting-edge technology may indicate a value of innovation, whereas outdated systems might suggest resistance to change or a focus on cost saving. Deciphering underlying assumptions. Uncovering implicit beliefs. The most challenging aspect of cultural diagnosis involves deciphering the underlying assumptions that guide behavior unconsciously. These are beliefs and perceptions so ingrained that they are taken for granted and seldom questioned unless directly challenged. Techniques for uncovering assumptions. Leaders can uncover these assumptions through techniques such as observational assessment, watching how people behave in meetings, how decisions are made, and how conflicts are resolved. Engagement and dialogue. Conducting interviews or focus groups where employees feel safe to express their views candidly. Feedback mechanisms. Utilizing surveys or suggestion boxes to gather anonymous insights into employee perceptions and beliefs. Using cultural analysis. Analyzing group dynamics. Cultural analysis helps leaders understand how group dynamics function within the organization. It reveals how individuals interact within groups, how groups align or conflict with each other, and how power and information flow through the organizational structure. Decision-making processes. By examining the decision-making processes, leaders can understand whether decisions are made through consensus, dictated by a few, or somewhere in between. This analysis can also reveal whether the organization's espoused values align with those observed in decision-making practices. Capacity for change. Understanding the organization's capacity for change involves assessing how flexible or rigid the culture is. It indicates whether the organization is likely to embrace new ideas and adapt to changes or resist them. This is crucial for implementing strategic changes and innovations. Conclusion. Effective leadership hinges on the accurate diagnosis of the organization's culture. By understanding the group's history, identifying visible artifacts, and deciphering the underlying assumptions, leaders are better equipped to navigate complex organizational landscapes and guide their organizations through periods of change. This thorough cultural understanding allows leaders to strategically align their actions and policies with the deep-seated values and practices of the organization, fostering a cohesive and adaptive cultural environment. B. Embedding and reinforcing culture. Embedding and reinforcing culture strategic approaches for leaders. Edgar Schein emphasizes the critical role of leaders in embedding and reinforcing organizational culture. This process involves strategic efforts to cultivate and sustain the desired cultural attributes that support organizational goals and values. Leaders can influence culture through their attention, reactions, behaviors, and how they reward and recognize employees. Additionally, Schein highlights the importance of role modeling, teaching, and coaching as effective mechanisms for cultural embedding. K methods for embedding and reinforcing culture. 1. Focusing attention. Leaders signal what is important by where they direct their attention. If leaders consistently focus on certain metrics, behaviors, or outcomes, employees will naturally perceive these elements as priorities. For instance, if a leader regularly checks on customer satisfaction outcomes, the organization will understand that customer service is a critical value. 2. Reacting to crises. How leaders react to crises not only tests the strength of the organizational culture, but also reinforces certain values. During crises, the decisions made by leaders, the transparency of communication, and their commitment to core values can reinforce a culture of integrity and resilience or expose weaknesses in the organizational ethos. 3. Demonstrating behaviors. Leaders are under constant observation, and their behaviors serve as a model for the rest of the organization. By consistently behaving in ways that align with the desired organizational culture, leaders embed these behaviors deeper into the organizational fabric. For example, by showing respect and openness in discussions, leaders can foster a culture of inclusivity and open communication. 4. Allocating rewards. How rewards such as promotions, bonuses, and public acknowledgments are allocated can powerfully reinforce certain behaviors and set cultural norms. Rewarding teamwork, innovation, or customer focus, depending on the organization's objectives, helps solidify these traits as valued aspects of the culture. Schein's mechanisms for cultural reinforcement. Role modeling. Leaders act as role models, and their actions teach employees what is acceptable and expected. This role modeling is more effective when leaders consciously demonstrate behaviors that reflect the organizational values in everyday actions and decisions. Teaching. Leaders must also take on the role of teachers, explicitly educating team members about the why and how of cultural expectations. This may involve formal training sessions or more informal mentoring and storytelling that illustrate the culture in action. Coaching. Coaching differs from teaching in its personalized approach and ongoing nature. Through coaching, leaders can provide direct feedback and guidance to employees, helping them to understand and internalize cultural norms. This method is particularly effective in addressing specific behavioral adjustments and fostering professional development aligned with cultural goals. Challenges in embedding culture. Consistency. One of the main challenges in embedding culture is maintaining consistency across different levels of the organization and over time. Leaders must ensure that cultural values are not only communicated, but also consistently upheld in daily operations. Alignment. Another challenge is ensuring that all aspects of the organization, such as its structure, processes, and policies, align with the desired culture. Misalignment can undermine efforts to embed the culture and create confusion among employees. Adaptability. As organizations evolve, so too must their cultures. Leaders face the challenge of adapting the culture in response to external changes, while maintaining core values. This requires a delicate balance between flexibility and stability. Conclusion. Effective embedding and reinforcing of culture are crucial for organizational success and sustainability. Through focused attention, appropriate reactions to crises, exemplary behavior, and strategic reward allocation, leaders can profoundly influence the organizational culture. Moreover, by employing role modeling, teaching, and coaching, leaders can ensure that the culture is not only understood, but also embraced and practiced throughout the organization. This comprehensive approach enables a robust, cohesive, and adaptive cultural environment that supports long-term organizational goals. 4. Practical implications for leaders. Strategies for cultural transformation. Schein offers strategies for leaders aiming to change organizational culture. This includes creating psychological safety for learning new behaviors, providing clear and consistent messages about new cultural norms, and aligning organizational structures and systems with new values. Leaders must be aware of the complexities and resistances they might face, and prepare to deal with them strategically. B. Leadership styles and culture. The book explores how different leadership styles can influence and be influenced by organizational culture. Leaders must adapt their style not only to the existing culture, but also to the desired future culture. Organizational Culture and Leadership by Edgar Schein provides a comprehensive guide to understanding the foundational elements of organizational culture, and offers practical advice for leaders on how to effectively influence and manage this culture.
What would the behavior look like a year from now? And I would force it to the point of saying, well, I guess I'd have my salespeople go out as pairs and maybe even measure them as a pair. Now we're getting, to where we can maybe work something. So how would we get the current people in sales to trust each other enough to go out as a pair? Now we can develop a program. But until we have that specific behavioral concept in mind, that we want people to not just collaborate as some vague concept, but it means they go out as teams and they get rewarded as teams. Then we're beginning to specify the change goal. And then we could look at the culture and say, how are we going to get there? What's helping us? Do we have other examples of teamwork that we can draw on? And on the other hand, the personnel system that's been totally individually pay oriented, that may be a hindrance, that we may have to change some things there.
Okay.
But it's all geared to this concept of someday my salespeople are going to go out as a team and trust each other. And once I have that goal, I can begin to generate a change program.
Okay. Now, do you find that organizations often look internal, try to come up with those answers when many other organizations might have tackled that same issue of group pay, for instance, and best practices that exist? I mean, is it better to try and bring that up from within, or do you sometimes have to teach new skills and approaches and techniques for any of the change to really be understood?
Well, it goes back to what culture is. If culture is personality or character, then best practices, you realize, is irrelevant. I would like to be like that person. Well, good luck. So best practices have been evolved in a culture in another organization.
Okay.
And 9 times out of 10 in my experience, when we take that best practice into our culture, it suddenly doesn't work because it was evolved in a different culture.
Okay.
And it involves all sorts of elements, behavioral and otherwise, that don't fit us. So I think if you have a culture mentality, you have to be very careful not to have a best practices mentality, because it will lead you to false solutions that in the end won't work. Much better to say, to take the logic of perpetual improvement and say we can always do better. So let's start some internal improvement processes to see how we can do better with what we're trying to do, rather than imitating what somebody else is doing.
Okay. So as they start to implement some improvements and maybe see the results and positive feedback from those improvements, what do they have to do to sustain the focus? Because often, a crisis will occur, another problem, and then they may revert to a top-down approach or a non-collaborative approach or something that's in contrast with the behavior they were looking to build. So, what's it take to sustain the focus?
I think if you've got those groups working initially properly, that question has to be addressed to them.
Okay.
You've thought of a new way of doing things. How are we going to keep going? They will then recognize what structural changes have to be made to sustain it. But that's not a job for an outside expert. That's a job for inside the culture. In the same way, let's say you as a personality are going to change a habit, and weight loss is the perfect example. You're going to go off that very quickly when you're invited to a couple of dinners and so on. And I think what all the weight programs have discovered is telling you not to do that is not the same as saying, well, how are you going to evolve your own stability so that when you're tempted to go off it, you'll still stay with it.
Okay.
That's an internal problem that really is the essence of thinking culturally, that you don't treat it as a superficial, okay, we'll make a couple behavioral changes and hope for the best. But rather, if we really need to change the culture, we've also got to build in all the structural supports that will keep it maintained.
Okay, that makes sense. So, if you're engaging the organization and helping to define the improvements that will make it sustainable and the new habits and structures that will reinforce it, then what about the larger organizations where you can't directly engage everyone in defining those aspects? There might be a core group or teams you engage, but the organization's too large to really engage everyone so they feel a part of the effort. How do large organizations deal with that challenge?
Again, I think it's not the consultant's job to figure that out. I think it's the organization's job to figure that out, because companies have very different ways of engaging people. And most hierarchies are designed to allow you to send a process down through the system. A very good quick example was a company president and his COO came to me to ask about changing a very rigid old culture that they had. I forced them to give me an example, and the example was the COO said that I have this meeting and people always sit in the same places And just yesterday, most of them were gone, but we're in this big room and they're still sitting all in these different places. And I, being curious, said, well, what did you do? And he suddenly laughed and woke up and said, oh my God, I did nothing. And he then realized that by his not doing anything, he was actually reinforcing this cultural rigidity that he was complaining about. So then we spent the next couple of hours just asking, well, you're the bosses. What can you do differently tomorrow when you go back? And they thought of dozens of things that they could directly impact the organization just by changing their own behavior. And then they could go to their subordinates and say, what are you doing to keep this up? And ask them to ask their subordinates. So the hierarchy is, if it's used that way, is very effective. One of the traps is the boss thinks if I announce it, it'll happen instead of enforce it. Enforcing means he says to the subordinates, from now on, I want to do things differently. And I want a weekly report on how you're going to do that.
Okay. What about the middle leader, lower level leader that says, well, I can't really impact my culture. I know it's a problem. I know it's impacting my business problem, but I just can't influence it.
Well, I think that leads to a whole other issue of subcultures.
Okay.
That middle manager is living in a silo or in a department or in a group that has evolved its own culture. And 9 times out of 10, if something gets stuck in the middle, it's because there is a disagreement or a clash between that middle subculture and the top. Let me give you an example. In safety programs, say in power companies, the top will say safety is number one, and we want safety issues always to be predominant. And then I'm talking as a consultant to a middle manager, and he knows or she knows that they have a timeout program, which is a very important way to deal with safety. And in his group, there have been 2 or 3 timeouts very recently. He's gotten impatient with it and has told his supervisors, how come you have so many timeouts? It's taking us off the schedule and it's making my productivity numbers look bad. And he doesn't realize that he's now abandoned the safety goal.
Right.
And is working his subculture issue, which is schedule and productivity. So the senior manager has to be aware of that and to make sure, if he really wants that middle manager to pay attention to safety, he has to be sure not to punish him for schedule and productivity failures. But most senior executives don't understand that. They say, I want both. I want perfect safety and perfect productivity. And they forget that middle managers can't do that. They have to choose. And they'll usually choose according to what the system rewards them for.
Okay.